Okay, thank you.
The fun to be co-host. I can admit people. It's a power I haven't. Any other changes are impacting animal migratory patterns, fish populations, and plant distributions, threatening ancient ways of life and important food sources. So I'm going to talk about heat for a little while, kind of how it impacts people in general, and then I'm going to spend some time focusing more on my work in Alaska. Um, So I am gonna say here the next few slides are pretty dense. So if you have questions as we go through this, please speak up. Um, the first thing that I want to talk about is how we think of heat. So what is hot? There are many ways that we measure that we measure heat. The first one is air temperature alone. This is standardized as measuring the temperature of the air at 5 feet above the ground using a thermometer. But this isn't a complete measurement. The heat index is something that we talk about a lot. It's often talked about in weather apps or on weather reports. And this is a combination of both temperature and humidity and is calculated in shady areas. The heat index can increase by up to 15 degrees if you are in direct sun compared to a shady area. A kind of more comprehensive measure is called the wet bulb globe temperature, and this is a measure of heat stress measured in direct sunlight and takes into account temperature, humidity, wind speed, sun angle, and cloud cover. This measure was calculated by the US military and young, healthy military recruits, and so it has some limitation on its applicability to the general population. Each of these has a cutoff for what's considered unsafe. For example, the wet bulb globe temperature upper limit of survivability without cooling measures such as air conditioning or water or things like that. This measure was found to be 95 degrees Fahrenheit at 100% humidity. But it is important to keep in mind what's unsafe for someone who's young and healthy is very different than what is unsafe for those who are medically complex or elderly or kind of on the extremes of age. Further, heat exposure can be complicated or exacerbated by poor air quality or other environmental factors. Heat illness or heat stroke is the leading cause of environmental exposure related death in the US. This number has been increasing consistently for several years. In 2021, per CDC reports, there were 1,600 deaths related directly to heat. In 2022, there were just over 1,700. And in 2023, that was until 2024 ended, the hottest year on record, 2,300 people died. We're still waiting on the numbers for 2024, but I would guess that this is probably higher than 2023. And the other thing that I want to note here is that this number is probably underreported, and that's having to do with how things are recorded in the medical records and how that is then um, researched and recorded through epidemiology. I also want to note that heat exposure has impacts on other illnesses aside from just heat stroke itself. It is well documented that increasing temperatures increase rates of heart attacks, strokes, asthma exacerbations, COPD exacerbations, pneumonia, injuries to kidneys, kidney failure, and it also has impacts on interpersonal and domestic violence and can lead to decompensation of mental health and increased rates of suicidality. Heat really impacts every aspect of health. Many medications impair the body's ability to regulate internal temperature. This further increases heat exposure. This is most common in folks who have underlying heart, lung, or kidney disease and mental illness. As you can tell, these consistent increases in heat will continue to overwhelm our already overburdened health system and cause extreme harm to people. Preparedness, community resilience, and mitigation efforts will quite literally be saving lives. So we just talked about defining heat, and we know that historically things are getting warmer. But what can we expect going forward? The US is actually warming faster than the global average. The map on the left shows the rate of temperature change over the last century. The greatest warming has been seen in Alaska. On average, the Arctic is warming 2 to 4 times faster than the rest of the planet, and we see consistent trends here in Alaska. Much of the greatest warming generally is at higher latitudes. This is concerning because many of these areas, people are not used to managing the heat. The maps on the right show the warming relative to the average global temperature change. At a warming level of 2 degrees Celsius, 3 degrees Celsius, and 4 degrees Celsius. So the top map here is 2 degrees, and then here is 3 degrees, and just on the bottom right is 4 degrees. Particularly at the 4 degrees Celsius warming level, we see the US experiencing exceptional warming. At this global warming level, throughout most of the country, the mean summer temperature will increase 8 degrees, and the timelines for reaching these temperatures vary greatly on how emissions are managed. In high or very high emission scenarios, reaching those 2 degrees C global warming level is likely to happen in the next 10 to 15 years, and some people are concerned that we've already reached it. Aggressively controlled emission scenario can potentially avoid or peak and then return down from this level. It's also important to note that these projections are imperfect. So when we're talking about averages, this is really hard, I think, for me to conceptualize, and I think a lot of people have a hard time conceptualizing what is like an average seasonal temperature increase mean. If you're used to a high of 95 degrees in the summer, increasing that by a couple of degrees doesn't seem like that big of a deal, but it isn't that simple. Complex climate modeling takes into account weather patterns, precipitation, drought, and many other factors that are influenced by temperature changes. On a day-to-day basis, we care about what we will actually experience. So these projections from the National Climate Assessment provide that context. I think a 105-degree day is something that we can all really like viscerally understand, right? Like that's hot. Depending on where you live, this may or may not be an abnormal occurrence. When I was in Fresno for residency, it felt like as soon as May rolled around, all the way through October, it was always over 100 degrees. It's a little bit of an exaggeration, but not too much. Fortunately, most places don't deal with the temperatures this hot very often. On the left is a map of how many more days a year will be over 105 degrees at this average change of 2 degrees Celsius warming. These dark red areas in the Southwest and Texas and Oklahoma, the dark red is about an increase of 20 or more days. And these are areas that already deal with these temperatures. This is not going to be too much of a shock to the system. However, if we look at the map on the right, we see that this dark red is spread through much more of the country and into places that don't usually experience these days of 105 degrees. And not only is it more widespread, but a lot of those areas in dark red are increased by 60 or more days a year. So this is a huge difference in the number of hot days that we're going to experience. That temperature, the time range that we're seeing that is also expanding pretty significantly. The thing that's kind of special about this temperature of 105 is not only the impacts that it has on health, but it also can cause impacts to infrastructure. So we can see in Portland last year during the heat wave where it was over 105, the rails for the light rail in the city were bending and they actually couldn't run the light rail a lot. This also can cause damage to roads, and this further impacts people's ability to access healthcare with interruptions in transportation. So we're not only increasing the risk to health, but we're also impairing the ability for people to access healthcare. I want to kind of drill down a little bit on this idea of how heat means different things in different places. In medicine, we have a saying that your zip code has more of an impact on your health than anything else, be that like your family history, your own personal health issues at baseline. And we see this holding true for heat exposure as well. There's a handful of studies here that I've quoted, and kind of the main takeaway from all of them is that if you live further north, you are more prone to having heat-related illness. And that includes things like heat stroke, but it also includes all-cause mortality, so death from anything, hospitalizations for heart attack, stroke, respiratory disease. And we see those changes, those impacts happening at much higher rates in the zip codes further north than we do seeing them at zip codes further south. So I'm going to bring it to Alaska now. This has been kind of my main focus for the past year and a half. And I I think it's really interesting, and there's a lot of challenges that these folks face that we don't have to deal with in the lower 48, but they also are a bit of a canary in the coal mine, because it is warming so much faster there. So one of the reasons that I think that this is important for everyone to know about is what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. Um, I don't know if anyone here has lived in the Arctic or has visited there. It's a pretty remote place, and I think a lot of us, if we're not actively thinking about it, don't really think about how it can impact us too. So as I mentioned, it is warming 2 to 4 times faster than the rest of the planet. And that, like I said, provides this kind of canary in the coal mine so we can see how things are going to change further south as they're changing in Alaska and the rest of the Arctic. The other thing that's really important to know is the Arctic holds a lot of carbon for us. It's a huge carbon sink. The permafrost in Alaska, in the Arctic, holds 1,400 gigatons of carbon. To provide some context for that, that's 4 times the amount of all human emissions since the Industrial Revolution, which is when we started measuring carbon for climate change. And that's twice the amount of carbon that currently is in the atmosphere. The boreal forests in the Arctic also hold 700 gigatons of carbon, which is equal to the amount of carbon that we currently have in the atmosphere. And this is also about a half to two-thirds of the global forest carbon. I think we talk a lot about the Amazon and the rainforest as being important carbon sinks, but the Arctic boreal forests are arguably as important, or if not more important, in holding carbon. And as wildfires intensify, as things warm, as vegetation changes, we're losing these forests and they become a source of carbon rather than a carbon sink.
Mhm.
And then this kind of touches a little bit again on this idea that temperature is relative, right? So it is heating much faster in Alaska, and it's going to complicate so many things that they're already dealing with. It's pretty cold there, and for me, as someone who grew up in California and warm to pretty temperate climates, I am not tough enough to live there. But they are also not prepared for the heat that is coming for them. Um, the heat distribution changes are not equal. So if we look at the northernmost part of Alaska, in the past 50 years, it's actually warmed 6 degrees Fahrenheit. And this is compared to the lower 48, which has on average warmed by 1.5 to 2.5 degrees Fahrenheit. So this is a huge change, right? We're looking at much greater changes, much more rapid changes. So I want to kind of talk about all of the kind of widespread impacts of heat from here on out. One of the things that Alaska is also experiencing, is a huge increase in their wildfires. Between 2000 and 2020, there were 2.5 times the number of acres burned compared to the prior 20 years. This increase was both due to the more frequent fires and larger fires. The burned area of Alaska is projected to increase between 24 and 170% by 2050. This is in part due to warmer days and warmer night times. And these warming temperatures allow fires to even stay over the winter. So they may not be burning in bright blazes all winter, but they can survive throughout the entire winter. There's also been a pretty significant decrease in snowpack, and the snow season has shortened by 3 weeks. This has allowed for more plants to grow, which increases the amount of fuel provided, to the fires and allowing them to burn much bigger and much more intensely. There are also increases in lightning strikes, and this is responsible for the starting of many of the fires. So the fires themselves, the blazes are really scary, right? We see this like with damaged infrastructure. This is less of an issue in Alaska just due to the sheer size of the state. But what we do see is the impacts of air quality that smoke has. Um, Smoke wildfire smoke has a pretty toxic makeup. It includes things like carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, methane, and other organic compounds, nitrogen compounds, and particulate matter. The particulate matter thing that we talk about the most is PM 2.5, and this is a very small particle size. This particle size is really important to talk about because it's so small that it can enter deep into the respiratory system and potentially even cross into the bloodstream. Larger particles can cause irritation to the eyes, nose, and throat, but have less of a health impact compared to PM 2.5. There's also some recent literature that's concerning that PM 2.5 from wildfire smoke is actually more toxic than PM 2.5 from ambient air, even in similar concentrations. With the increase in frequency and size of wildfires in Alaska, it's anticipated that there will be a 100% increase in wildfire-specific PM 2.5 exposure for the population by mid-century. Air quality affects nearly every aspect of health, similarly to heat. It includes worsening lung disease, raising risk of heart attack and stroke, increased rates of various cancers, impacts on pregnancy outcomes, worsening diabetes, and impacts on various neurological diseases. These impacts are independent of the effects of heat, but when you are exposed to increasing temperatures and poor air quality, they have a synergistic effect and can cause even worse health outcomes. In Alaska, it was also found that Black and African American Alaskans and Alaskan Athabascans, which is one of the native populations, are specifically already exposed to higher wildfire PM 2.5 concentrations than the rest of the state population. We see these environmental justice disparities play out across the country, and the Arctic is no exception. One of the greater concerns with air quality in Alaska is that there is very limited ground data gathering and monitoring, and the most of the air quality monitors are in the state are in the urban centers, which often are far away from where the fires are. And this makes air quality recommendations and alerts difficult to distribute, especially to those rural and remote communities where many of the native populations live. Exploring ways to both decrease smoke exposure and increase monitoring capacity would greatly benefit health. One of the things that's pretty unique in Alaska and also really interesting is permafrost. Permafrost thaw is really important and it's happening pretty quickly. And we don't really know how to study it well. There's some groups that are learning how to predict it and map it, but it's still kind of a poorly understood thing that's happening. And it is a huge impact on health and life in the Arctic. The thawing itself can lead to damage to infrastructure where basically the ground sinks and any structures on top of the ground can have their foundations disrupted. It can damage sewage lagoons, which is one of the common ways that waste is managed in the Arctic. It can damage roads and runways, and this can further isolate areas that are already remotely isolated. It also interrupts traditional methods of storing food. There are things called permafrost cellars, which are essentially holes in the ground in the permafrost, which they essentially act as a refrigerator. And as the permafrost thaws, it contaminates the food that's stored there, and also those warming temperatures don't keep the food cold enough, and there's threats to health from that. Um, as the permafrost thaws, there's also rapid coastal and riverine erosion. In some places in the state, the coast is eroding by dozens of feet a year. And often this happens in quick bursts where you can see 10, 20, 30 feet of the coast just fall into the ocean at a time. Flooding also increases rates of permafrost thaw by causing rapid rewarming of the frozen soil. As permafrost thaws, previously inactive microbes begin to decompose the organic matter, and this leads to methane release. Um, there are some studies trying to quantify the amount of methane release from permafrost. And the reason that we care about methane is also a very potent greenhouse gas. It's about 25 times more potent than carbon dioxide. And also exposure to ground level methane is known to exacerbate respiratory disease and has the potential to lead to cancer and birth defects. Permafrost thaw also has the potential to lead to new infectious diseases. In 2016, there was an anthrax outbreak in Siberia that was attributed to a reindeer that had been previously frozen in permafrost thaw. 2,000 reindeer died from this exposure, and several people became very ill from the incident. There's also potential for exposure to unknown illnesses because we don't know what is stored in the permafrost. There's also potential for water quality impacts and toxin exposure. Thawing permafrost can lead to rapid drainage of lakes, leading to changes in stream flow, and with it, movement of heavy metals into the water tables. There's also concern that waste from prior oil and gas explorations that were disposed of by drilling into the permafrost are being released into the water system similarly. There's also really limited water quality monitoring available in Alaska. And finally, vegetation patterns are changing as the permafrost thaws. This has the potential to continue worsening wildfire impacts, and it can also change the types of vegetation in those areas, which can lead to further warming of the permafrost and create this feedback loop. Next, I want to touch on sea ice. So the sea ice is also melting. Um, Sea ice is really important. It acts as a barrier, as protection for winter storms, and helps prevent erosion. So loss of the sea ice is further contributing to that rapid coastal erosion from the combination of permafrost thaw. The winter storms are also becoming a lot stronger along the coast. There's projected to be about a month of time where there is no sea ice protection along the coast, and this overlaps with the worsening storm season. So we can expect to see worsening erosion and worsening coastal storms along both the Chukchi and Beaufort seas. And this can also worsen the flooding and erosion impacts. This is a study that was done a few years ago looking at flooding and erosion and permafrost thaw. While these things don't necessarily have direct impacts on health, aside from occasional injuries due to erosion episodes or drowning in floods, what we worry about is the impacts to buildings, to ability to travel, and for ability for people to communicate. Um, Erosion can happen really rapidly, as mentioned earlier. And the thing that's important here is about 80% of the Alaskan population lives along some coast, and approximately 144 rural communities are currently threatened by this combination of erosion, flooding, and permafrost thaw. You can see the map here. You can see the coastal communities, and then the communities inland are often along different rivers. So one of the things that we talk about a lot with the erosion and flooding and permafrost thaw is community relocation. A couple of communities have decided to relocate. You can do managed retreat, which is kind of strategically moving individual buildings, or you can move the entire community to a new, safer place. Managed retreat is nice because you get to stay kind of in your home, but it may not provide as great of protection as moving the entire community. There are many barriers to community relocation. This is a list here that is not comprehensive by any means. Um, there's a lot of funding issues. Full relocation requires funding from many agencies and coordination between different funding sources. And they're somewhat limited by the grant cycles that their funding comes from. In many of the Native communities, they don't have grant divisions, right? A lot of these like federal funding resources are often targeted to city and municipal governments that have grant divisions. They have a handful of highly trained staff that are dedicated to securing grant funding, and that often just doesn't exist in these really small communities of a couple hundred people. And those who are often working on grants also wear many other hats, so they're really strapped for resources. Further, these communities have been kind of marginalized by the government for a long time, and there's this extensive history of displacement, marginalization, and violence. There's high rates of medical illness, substance use, depression, and suicide, and they are particularly overburdened from this. There's also distrust in the government based on historical practices and historical laws. And all of these things combined with the remote nature of these villages really limits their ability to obtain funding and be safe and have their health taken care of. To give some context, building a really small house in one of these native villages can cost $500,000, and that's basically just for the bones of the house. That doesn't even necessarily include plumbing. So I want to talk about a couple of these communities. The New Talk is probably the most well well known. Patagonia made a film about this community a couple years ago, and it's definitely worth a watch. Um, the Newtok is the number seven most threatened community based on that study that I mentioned earlier. They decided to relocate in 1994, so 30 years ago. They began that relocation process then. They identified a site 9 miles away called Murtarvik, and in 1996, a land exchange was initiated with the U.S. Department of Fish and Wildlife. In 2003, so almost a decade later, Congress approved the land exchange, a literal act of Congress had to be done for them to even start their transition to this new space. The continued accumulation of sediment from rapid erosion continued to interfere with barge delivery of supplies, and the rebuilding process slowed significantly. Because the community is receiving funding for relocation, they are often ineligible for funding to improve their current site in Newtok. At this point, Retarvik has a community center and enough housing units for about half of the community to relocate. This has taken 30 years and cost over $200 million, and we still haven't seen completion of this move. Another community that's working on relocation is Shishmaref, which is kind of further north. This community voted much earlier. They started working on this in 1973. They've had a couple of votes. In 2016, they had a site selection, but the land still hasn't been secured. While the planning committee is working, Shishmaref is pursuing local resilience projects, including a backup generator, improving water supply, conducting seawall and coastal flooding analysis, and providing skills training for local community members, and focusing on improving the intergovernment relations and elevating tribal knowledge. As you can tell, both of these communities have encountered many barriers to relocation. It's very expensive and politically complex to navigate these moves, and the interaction with multiple federal agencies for funding and land further muddies the waters. Time is of the essence in these situations, and work is being done to explore how to support these communities and how it can be accelerated. There's technical assistance available from many federal agencies to help with the grant process. However, this is just a single aspect of a multifaceted issue. The complexity is large, in a large part, is preventing other communities from pursuing relocation. However, their delaying may threaten their livelihoods. So a couple other impacts that we're seeing from heat. Food is a really big part of this. The ocean temperatures have increased pretty significantly, and this has led to harmful algal blooms, causing toxin release and food contamination. It's also impacted the fish populations and the fishing industry. The fishing industry in Alaska, again, is another place where we see how this impacts not only those living locally, but the entire country. It provides about two-thirds of the US seafood harvest and supports 26,000 jobs, which is about 10% of the Alaskan workforce, and it provides about $4.5 billion a year in wholesale value of seafood. The industry is threatened by increasing ocean temperatures, sea ice melt, marine heat waves, and ocean acidification. There's not a whole lot to do with it for this besides prevent further warming and acidification. Um, and the other place that we're seeing this is impacts on fishing itself for the from a subsistence standpoint. So I want to talk a little bit more about subsistence practices. Subsistence is essentially the practice of gathering food from your local resources. So this includes vegetation gathering, so berries and other plants, and then fishing, hunting. It's important. It's a really important source of food and nutrition for many of the rural and remote native villages. In general, rural communities get about 25% of their caloric intake from subsistence practices, where some are getting up to 80% of their caloric intake from subsistence practices. If we lose the ability for them to have these practices, it would cost about $230 to $450 million a year, which would be a direct cost to those folks there. Not only would this be really expensive, but the food supply would become more vulnerable to disruptions in supply chain than already exist. Talking to some folks who live there, when food deliveries come to these remote villages, often there's a big rush to the grocery store, and the grocery store is completely emptied within a matter of days. And then it can take weeks for them to get deliveries, assuming that there's no interruptions from weather or other transportation issues. Um, the other thing is traditional foods provided by subsistence also have a higher nutrient density. As mentioned earlier, changes in the ocean temperatures and acidification are changing species of fish that are available. There have also been massive warming events leading to die-offs of salmon and other fish, further impacting availability of food. As the permafrost thaws, there's also changes in vegetation, and there's some concern that invasive species may outcompete traditional berry populations. In native communities, the scarcity of subsistence resources has also led to difficulty passing down the traditional knowledge from elders to younger tribal members. This further jeopardizes the food supply from subsistence practices, threatening opportunities for self-determination and community resilience. Already, a review of studies from 1987 to 2019 found an overall decrease in intake of subsistence foods in native communities. Between the risk of loss for subsistence foods and the interruption of traditional food storage methods such as permafrost cellars, food security poses a great threat to the future of rural and remote Alaskan people. Lastly, I want to kind of talk a little bit more about how rural these communities are. When I started working on this project in Alaska, it was really difficult for me to understand like how big it is, right? It's huge. It's about a third of the size of the entire United States. And it's much more sparsely populated. So there's about one person per square mile, which is 1% as dense as the rest of the US. The remote nature of these communities also leaves them vulnerable to infrastructure damage, as we've been talking about. And there's also a lack of redundancy in things like electrical grids or heat sources. There can be huge costs to repair and replace even the most small infrastructure impacts, and the time to get these things can be impacted and delayed significantly. There are also great threats to access to food and healthcare. Anytime you interrupt someone's ability to access transportation, you can delay their access to healthcare, leading to further worsening healthcare impacts. Um, and as mentioned earlier, often they're only accessible by air or water. And if there is damage to a landing strip, or there's changes in the sea ice or frozen rivers, which is often how they travel in the winter, um, or the thawing of the permafrost also makes it really hard to travel over. All of these further isolate them from resources. So not everything is bad. It seems, I think every time I talk about this, it seems like nothing good is going on. So I do want to highlight some things that are really impressive that are happening up north. Um, a handful of the tribal areas have come up with really impressive adaptation strategies. So the first one is the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, pictured here. This is where Newtok is located. So they developed climate adaptation strategies. It's a comprehensive plan for the YK Delta region, published 5 years ago. It engaged many federal, state, and local organizations, as well as the tribes and community members. It is, quote, guided by approaches undertaken by Indigenous communities globally and by our own 10,000 years of experience adapting to novel sociopolitical, ecological, and technological challenges. This community-based and community-led plan provides an excellent model for others to follow. By allowing the community to lead, their greatest strengths and vulnerabilities can be best identified, uplifted, and addressed in the context of those folks that are most affected. 3 focus areas were identified, each with a list of specific objectives and actions of varying degrees of priority. The first focus area was community infrastructure, the second, subsistence resources and harvest practices, and the third, trails and transportation. It included future projections of temperature changes, sea level rises, and precipitation for the region, then outlined a 100-year vision for the region to emphasize the importance of self-realization and self-actualization of Indigenous ways of life and the importance of maintaining these practices for future resilience. Interestingly, despite an extensive discussion of the rapid warming occurring in the region, he is not identified as a potential threat in the 3 focus areas. Kodiak Island also hosted a 2-day workshop called Adapt Kodiak. This was a similar project, but it was a smaller project than the YK Delta, but still engaged state, tribal, and local stakeholders. The 2-day conference had 4 sessions, each which had a speaker with opening remarks followed by small group discussions. Their 4 topics were fisheries futures, food security and subsistence, infrastructure and energy, and culture and wellness. Each session would summarize the strengths, weaknesses, and potential future actions. However, the document does not have a forward-facing plan. A similar summit was held in Southeast Alaska and Ketchikan. A great deal of discussion during these meetings was around marine and riverine water conditions and air and water quality. There were also some concerns raised about wildfires and landslides with changes in precipitation. There is great concern regarding changes in salmon migration and notes that the migration of other animal species is also changing. Finally, there's extensive discussion about importance of community-based monitoring and enthusiasm of many of those in the community to engage in local environmental observation networks and the like in collaboration with academic organizations, NGOs, federal agencies, and traditional knowledge holders. The summit was designed similarly to a co-produced adaptation planning framework from Washington State. The framework first identified climate exposures, identified sensitivity to those exposures, and focused on adaptive capacity. The summit allowed for identification and discussion about specific exposures and encouraged the community to identify their own vulnerabilities and sensitivities to each. Several of the tribes from Southeast Alaska, in collaboration with federal agencies, also created an outline template for other Southeast Alaskan tribes, making this resource more widely available. Another area of promise is the local environmental observation networks, as mentioned with the Southeast Alaska project. These are a pretty more and more commonly a partnership found across Alaska. It taps into the local knowledge of a landscape and the people in those areas who have lived and worked on the land for generations. The familiarity with the landscape helps to detect abnormal changes very early, abnormal behavior of animals, water sample collection, and other important pieces of data. These observations and data collection sources wouldn't be possible without the on-the-ground people, and many research groups do not have the resources or knowledge to collect them themselves. This then can be used to analyze and provide information on safety and to better track many of the changes occurring in the Arctic. This co-produced knowledge, the teaming up of Indigenous knowledge and Western science, provides a more holistic outcome and allows for research to be done both in areas that may otherwise be neglected due to limited resources and to ensure that research is done in a way that will include and benefit folks that it is impacting. There are also several groups designing models to monitor and predict permafrost thaw, potentially allowing for better planning for future buildings of housing, roads, and other infrastructure. And a new satellite was just released last year to monitor methane release. It's currently primarily used to monitor methane emissions from oil and gas sites, but similar technology in the future may allow for more granular data to monitor permafrost methane emissions. So this may seem all very far from home and very overwhelming. Many of you, I imagine, face challenges in your day-to-day life already, and I think in the face of climate change, we are often met with doom and gloom more than hope. If there's anything that I'd like you all to take from this talk today, it's that you're not alone in this. Just in regards to the work in Alaska in the last year and a half, I've spent time with folks from many backgrounds and with many interests and many areas of expertise. None of us have the answer alone, but it's the reaching past ourselves, out of our boxes and out of our comfort zones, asking what may feel like stupid questions. I feel like I've asked a lot of stupid questions the last year and a half, or coming up with ideas that maybe feel far-fetched, but hopeful. This is where we can make progress. Please know that there are so many people thinking about this and working on this with their whole hearts and brains, and that there will always be space for you to join in, to grieve, and to celebrate. So thank you for having me today. And this is my huge list of resources, and I'll go ahead and take any questions if you guys have any.
All right. Very good. Lily, you want to?
Yeah, I can get us going with the questions. This was such a great presentation. I love that, the room to grieve and to celebrate. Yes. So my first question just kind of had to do talking about the personal health effects. What I was wanting you to clarify a little bit. So the people who kind of live at those higher latitudes, they personally, their bodies just aren't like adapted to deal with the climate, the increased
Yeah.
temperatures.
Yeah, so this is
Yeah.
something that we don't understand super well. But there's definitely this signal that like your body we see this actually, it's really interesting. We see it kind of across the board where we see more heat illness that occurs
Hmm.
earlier in the year than later in the year. So those first hot temperatures that we see in May or June, those cause way more issues than the hot temperatures we see in August or September. And so there is some baseline adaptation that humans are able to develop to heat. And
Awesome.
if
Season
you,
kind
yeah, if you are living it in places where you're never exposed to these temperatures, you probably aren't able to make those changes as effectively. Folks who live in the north, right, like they're used to it being like -30. And
Mm-hmm.
so I was in Fairbanks last March and it was 15 degrees, okay? I was wearing every item of clothing that I brought with me.
Absolutely.
These folks are in t-shirts grilling in the park. I kid you not, right? Like,
They're
and
used
so,
to it. Yeah.
yeah, and so people just
Yeah.
have like their bodies are adapted to certain temperatures, and the ability to change that takes some time. And so I think a lot of what we see is concern for both the early season warm temperatures, but also these one-off hot days. Because
Mm-hmm.
if you don't have this baseline adaptation, you're much more vulnerable to this kind of random one really hot day. And I think that there's some work being done to better understand like how this happens and if there's ways to make it easier. But the other side of it is like we already know that it happens, and so we have to do something about it, right? And we
Yeah.
have to understand how we can protect people from that.
Yeah. Wow. That is so interesting. How different people react. I've got another question, but I don't want to take all the time for myself. Are other people having some burning questions? Oh, not burning, some pressing questions for Dr. Kouklis? There we go.
Could
I
unmute.
have one.
Yes, go ahead.
Sorry, my name is Tona. I'm first time to this meeting, and Lily, thank you both so much for hosting it and the information. Like, I want to cry, because it does affect all of us. We're in Southwest Michigan, but I don't care if it's Arctic or the South Pole, it still affects us. My question, I guess, kind of has to do with the Great Lakes. Here in Southwest Michigan, the Great Lakes affects a lot of our weather, and I just wondered, with any of this heating or anything that's happening, has there been any kind of studies, or do we have any kind of information, I guess, on the warming or just how Michigan and the surrounding areas would be affected by some of this increase in temperatures concerning how much water is around us?
That's I'm not sure. I know that we're definitely seeing one of the studies that I mentioned as far as like the impacts of heat on health. The northern latitudes, even in the lower 48. So like if we're looking at like Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, like the warming there does have greater impacts on people like going to the hospital or dying from all the different causes. I'm not sure if there's anything specific to Michigan that's been done to look at that, but we are definitely seeing those greater impacts of the warming, even at lower temperatures. So changing from 70 to 85 degrees, we see much greater presentations to the hospital at those higher latitudes. So like I said, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, than we do kind of in the lower states like Arizona, Texas, that kind of area.
Mhm.
Thank you.
I had another question if I can
Mhm.
pop one in while other people think of theirs. I wonder if there's been any like collaborations between other places that have somewhat similar geography and also somewhat similar like communities. So I know that the Sami indigenous people in Finland, they're going through kind of a similar, like the climate change is affecting them disproportionately to the other Finnish people.
Mhm.
Has there been any like collaboration between different geographical areas, sharing of
So
solutions?
yeah, there's a
Mhm.
circumpolar Arctic network, and
Okay.
they meet once every year or two, and they have representatives from all of the Arctic countries. So US, Canada, most of the Nordic countries, Russia plus minus, um, Greenland, Iceland.
Mm.
But there's like a conference every year or every
Okay.
2 years that happens, so they're able to share kind of
To share
what's going
solutions.
on. Yeah.
That's great. That is great.
Yeah.
So I have a question. So I'm pretty sure there are studies that look into the increase or the effect of heat and all of that. Also increase in PM 2.5 on asthma. Do you have
Mm.
anything to say about that?
Oh yeah, that's a very well documented impact. And we see both increased rates of asthma, so more people have asthma in those areas that have higher particulate matter. And then as temperatures get warmer and there are flares of particulate matter, we see more presentations for asthma exacerbations. So it's both on the development of asthma and then also on the severity of asthma that we see impacts there.
Mhm. Okay. I also had another question about, you mentioned some film that was made about New Talk. You
Yeah,
recommended it, but you didn't say the name. Do you?
I think it's just called New Talk.
Oh,
I
really?
can, yeah,
Okay.
I'll write the name of it here.
Okay.
Um, I will warn you, it's really sad.
Okay.
But I think it's really, there's a lot of interviews with the folks who live in the village, and it provides some really good insight into how this is impacting day-to-day life for folks who are there, and talks about kind of a little bit more in depth, like the natural history of what's been going on there, and then also kind of how all of the relations with the government entities have been impacting their ability to live and move. And there's like the cinematography of the area is incredibly striking.
Hmm.
Um, but it's not the first time I watched it, I only got like halfway through it before I had to stop, and then I came back to it maybe a year later.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah, it's pretty heavy.
Intense.
But
Okay.
I think it's something that is just because I think this idea is so it's not talked about a lot and it's really far removed from kind of the normal day-to-day thought of people, like the idea of permafrost. Most people have never seen permafrost, right? And so to conceptualize how that's impacting people, I think this is a really good way of capturing that.
Yeah. Okay.
Sure.
Other persons has comments or questions?
I had one more, but I don't want to. Oh, someone
No,
else.
go ahead.
I have a load of questions,
Yes.
Yeah.
but I am not sure. No, I have to kind of assimilate this. I will have to listen to this, definitely listen to this video. It has been so informative and so scary. And I have a nephew who lives in the middle of Finland.
Mm.
So I will be asking him if he has seen. He did say not so long ago that we haven't seen snow yet.
Hmm.
So he was right. Oh, thank you so much. This is a real wake-up call. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The analogy that I was thinking about is like a fire hose.
Yeah.
Hmm.
A fire hose of information.
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
You
so
know,
yeah.
that's been the more I thought about too. I didn't want to say anything how scary some of this sounded, but it's not as scary as it is if we don't wake up and pay attention and
Mm,
educate ourselves and our community. Because probably in the 1920s, there were scarier things in our world, and we've been able to come together and find solutions to move forward. So it's scary because we're listening to it going, oh, but I can remember half decade ago when they were talking about what the polar bears are going through. So bringing it closer to home, I look at our lake here in Southwest Michigan, Lake Michigan, and we're in Benton Harbor, Michigan. We have the premier Gene Clark Park, and how the waters are actually becoming less and less at the shoreline than they used to be if you pay attention to it. And so when we think about what she said about Alaska, it seems like it's so far away, but in this world we live in, they are our neighbors, and we better start paying attention to that and so much more about what she spoke about. And then when we think about what's happening, that we're all having attention to the wildfires in California and the ones that's happening now, I started thinking about this. They talked about over 240,000. I forget the exact numbers that this has had a devastating effect on. In our community, that is almost our entire county. That's from Benton Harbor to St. Joe to Niles to Buchanan to Galeen to New Buffalo to Coloma to Waterville. our entire county that is what is representing in California. And
Mm.
it's really something, and that's the wildfires. And I thought it was very interesting that our current governor actually implemented a wildfire division in the state of. That's been devastating because the smoke was coming straight here to Michigan, straight here to Southwest Michigan, over to Chicago, and we were feeling the effects. And then that came to another subject she spoke on, that was equally as important, the air quality and what that means, because we run an asthma program, the A for Asthma program in our county and in Benton Harbor, and how our asthmatics are sharing with us because of the change of the weather, what they're experiencing in the ER rooms. They're loaded. They're at the capacity of what people are going through who are asthmatic and having breathing problems when it gets too hot or too cold. So today's speaker really helped us. She took a little of the scariness out of it if we started thinking about how we must continue educating selves and educating our community about some of the subjects she spoke on, but all of the subjects, Dr. Murray, that you have been presenting to us on Environmental Fridays. And we think, and oh, the guest speaker, the host, she's even awesome. So she left
She's
Andrews, I
awesome.
think, last year. She needs to come back.
I know,
She's really
right?
good too. So you
Have me
had two
back.
great speakers today. So again, Dr. Murray, thank your whole team for this event today.
Thank you. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure we talked about the asthma aspect because with the effects of heat, with the effects of increase in the PM 2.5, those small particles, they would definitely have an effect on asthma. And have you tracked, for example, if there has been an increase in Alaska?
The data there is so sparse that there's not a
Okay.
whole lot. The kind of one main study that looks at it is the one that Dr. Micah Hahn did, and we did see increased rates of kind of asthma, COPD, and respiratory infections.
Mhm.
And it's not quite broken down as far into asthma
Okay.
specifically. But yeah, it's really hard. There's really limited data available for Alaska.
Okay.
Um, Recommendation information to share with the youth. That is a great question. Um, I can't think of anything off the top of my head. Um, if I think of something, I'll email it to Dr. Murray and have him send it out.
Okay.
Um, and I do just want to comment on the idea that like we're all neighbors in this, right? And I think even if we're all facing different challenges, we can learn so much from each other. And so being able to talk about like maybe it doesn't seem applicable to where you're living, but I think just the idea of being able to organize in a way that provides these basic community connections, that's, I think a lot of the main takeaway is there's a lot of power in the people and we can learn from each other so much, both on like how to take care of each other and how to take care of our planet. So yeah.
I would
For
say in
sure.
terms of recommendation is that our youth become more aware of their surroundings. I mean, like in urban America, the phrase being street smart could be translated into being like environment smart, into being aware of your surroundings. And I know they often focus on, what's in the palm of their hands, that cell phone and stuff. You could get information, of course, there about your environment, but they need to become a lot more conscious and aware. This is the world that they live in and are going to live in, and they need to be aware of things. I do think too, though, that there more and more youth, maybe even more aware than we may have given them to. So it's what do you think, Lily?
Yeah, I think it's incredible to if you look online, so many young people are very much aware maybe not of the specifics, of course, of the science, but of the general threat that climate change poses to their health. And I see a lot of that climate anxiety that you were talking about. Just kids even making jokes of like, yeah, if we're around to see it, like talking about that kind of thing.
Wow.
Yeah, so definitely the young people I think are aware of the threat and aware of the of the challenges involved in climate change and of small things that people can do, tiny little recycling, sustainable choices. But I think there's also an emerging sense of recognizing that the primary actors responsible aren't necessarily doing their due diligence in the cleaning up of things, but definitely the youth are aware of the threats. Yeah.
I did just think of one. There's the Sunrise Movement, which is a youth organizing
Yes.
group,
Yeah.
and they have divisions kind of across the country. So that would be a good group to connect with. And I'm sure that there's like many other youth
Yeah,
organizing groups, and
yeah.
those are great places for like kind of like the grief and celebration, right? Like I think we need to definitely make space for the grief, and we need to make space for those like dark jokes of like, are we going to be here to see it? But we
Yeah.
also need to like take into those like little wins, right? Because this is not going to be, we're not going to get one giant win and fix everything. We have to like recognize the small advances that we make and really celebrate those and acknowledge that there's strength in that. And I think that, oh, thank you, Lily. I think that like those community groups can be really powerful for that.
Mhm.
For sure. Sure.
Another question that came to mind that I'd like you to elaborate on is the effect, whether indirect or direct, of climate change on indigenous knowledge.
Yeah, so I think
Talked about
I'm
that.
definitely not the best person to speak on this, but my kind of sense is that the changes are limiting ability for traditional knowledge to be passed down.
Mm,
Um, and there's already been so many barriers put in place with that, right? Like we look back on the historic schools that have been in place, like the boarding schools and that sort of stuff, and loss of language, and loss of cultural practices, like that already exists. And so now we're taking away like the place where more much of this knowledge is passed down. And so there's definitely a huge threat to knowledge just from a resource standpoint. But I do think that there kind of a lot of the folks that I've talked to in the Native communities that I've been working with, there is also a sense of wanting to reclaim that. And in doing so, like protect themselves and protect other people. There's like a pride in the ability to contribute. And I think that we have a lot to learn from their practices. I think that if we returned to many of their ways of life, things would be a lot better.
mm,
And so it's a matter of like listening. And I think a lot of it, there's from a research perspective, right? Like Western research is done in a specific way that often doesn't jive well with traditional knowledge and indigenous knowledge. And so on our end, we have to be open to the idea that what we've been taught in research is not necessarily the right way to go about doing things. And so I think there has to be this, we have to make space for it, and we also have to uplift it and acknowledge that we also will have to change
mm,
to ensure that they don't lose any more of what they've already lost.
mhm, mhm. Okay. Well, I think, we could end here for today, but this hopefully would be a presentation that we keep coming back to in our minds and in how we approach the environment and coming up with solutions that could impact ourselves and our community. Lily, do you want to like say anything as we
Yeah, I just think the closing thoughts were thank you so much for your presentation. And I love that phrase that was on the building in your last slide there, what the hands do, the heart learns. So I think we can all commit to being active in our local communities and our hearts will learn that and we can hopefully make some change. So thank you, Dr. Kouklis, and thank you, Dr. Murray, for hosting this. It was a very good
Okay,
learning experience, I think. Mhm.
okay, very good. Thank you so much again, Gayle.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lily. Thanks to the audience, our regulars on here. Thank you so very much for coming up and showing out and participating. And this is a learning experience for all of us. Every Friday, I learn something different, something new.
Mm.
And so we want to thank our guest speakers and our host.
So much to consider, so much.
Yes,
And to do.
that's right. If it's Fridays, it's Environmental Fridays. Everyone has a great weekend.
You too.
too. Thank you, everyone.
Take care.
Thank you, and same to all. Right. Take
Thank
care, all.
you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
There we go. Thank you all. I will leave as well.